I've seen many YouTubers describe their dream F1 calendars, but there's not really much to dream up when you're limited to nothing but FIA Grade 1 tracks. So in this video, I decided to add a twist to these F1 calendar videos. I only drew from a selection of fictional tracks in video games. Not a single track in this video is real, but I think they could all make for a good or at least interesting F1 calendar, and it certainly makes for a more interesting video. But be warned, this list is going to get really weird. Very few video game tracks are designed with modern Formula 1 in mind, so it's impossible to make a proper calendar like we have today. So my calendar may defy norms and conventions, but should put up some good racing and fan service. This is my Formula 1 fictional track calendar. I only had a couple of rules for this video. None of the tracks could be real, but they all had to be physically possible for a standard F1 car to complete without damage. So that means no Rainbow Road on the calendar, unfortunately. The only other major rule that I had was that I couldn't use two tracks that took place in the same general location, such as London Circuit in Gran Turismo and London Royal Mile from Need for Speed Shift. I'm not the biggest F1 fan, but I did my best to pick a variety of tracks that would keep the schedule varied and the racing exciting. Now, some of these tracks, while possible to drive in an F1 car, are wildly unsafe. I didn't really worry myself over how a Grade 1 renovation could happen because that would be overthinking things. I also didn't worry too much about actual lap times since it's hard to calculate how F1 cars would perform. So if this list has tracks with questionable lap times, that's why. So first of all, what's an ideal opening track for the season? It should be moderately interesting with the crowd enthusiastic about the new season. So I'm starting off with Montclair from Real Racing 2. A forgotten racetrack now, Montclair was once one of the better tracks in the Real Racing series. The turns are completely varied, from the high-speed first turn to the hairpin, the Monaco-like tunnel, and even a bumpy chicane towards the end. I think it's a track that F1 cars could lend themselves well to. And the atmosphere is great, it almost feels like a carnival. There are hot air balloons in the distance, there's a Ferris wheel of all things, and the spectators are everywhere. They're staring down from this bridge, they watch from inside the tunnel, and don't tell me that building isn't a lodge of some kind. Imagine buying a hotel room with a view of the track. Anyways, this should be an exciting start to the season. But I'll admit that the next two tracks are probably going to be the most boring of the lot, although there is a reason to this. I was looking to find a racetrack similar to Monza, but the closest one I could find was the SHINJUKU A reverse course from Modellista. Unfortunately, it's a bit different, as the track is mostly flat out as opposed to Monza's mix of flat speed and sharp turns. But like Monza, there are some hard braking zones after long straightaways. And then the third track's completely different. I've gone with Rio de Janeiro from Forza Motorsport 6 and 7. This could very well be the hardest course to pass on, as it's incredibly tight, hilly, and dangerous. It's going to be a real challenge for the drivers just to finish, let alone make up positions. So why are SHINJUKU A Reverse and Rio de Janeiro on this calendar? And why this early? They're not particularly the most exciting tracks, and they also aren't really ones that make for great racing. They're probably going to be the most boring, so I want to get them out of the way, but more importantly, the teams and fans alike will receive good information from racing these tracks early. SHINJUKU A is a flat-out track and can test the team's high speed and braking power. Meanwhile, Rio tests a car's cornering abilities and downforce. With these two tracks in the first three, everyone will know which cars are the most ready for the season, meaning expectations are set properly, and the teams that are lagging behind are quick to correct their mistakes. After the insanity of Rio, we'll give the drivers some reprieve by following up with a simplistic track, but a good one nonetheless. Midfield Raceway from Gran Turismo is one of the easier tracks on the calendar, but there's charm in its simplicity, and it still has some good locations to overtake. On to the next race of the season, and now things are getting interesting. I've chosen the ALPINE from Forza Motorsport 1. Think of it like the layout of Spa, but with the size and elevation of the Red Bull Ring. I mean, look at that first turn, that's practically Castrol. The rest of the track is pretty tight, but there are a couple of good overtaking spots. Next up is ASTON from Live for Speed. Like Silverstone, Aston has a mix of fast, flowing, and tight. It's got some sweeping turns as well as flat out corners, but there's also a lot of tight, difficult turns. I was sold on this track when I saw how wild the onboard footage looks. I think the drivers will find this track very rewarding when they complete a fast lap, and hopefully the fans will realize this as well. Now, you'd be forgiven if you failed to recognize most of these racetracks so far, so I'm adding the more recent LAGO MAGGIORE from Gran Turismo 7. YouTuber Mitsos has performed an Assetto Corsa hot lap of the track, and I'm convinced it would work as a Grand Prix. It's also a pretty technical track, but I'm the most excited about this downhill to uphill hairpin turn. A banked hairpin at that angle is going to be a massive focal point to a race here, and I want to see that in action. After 3 races, it's back to a city course, and I've chosen a rather obscure one. Neo City Expert from F1 Challenge, a 90s Formula 1 game for the Sega Saturn. I guess whoever made this game couldn't secure the rights to more than 3 real-life racetracks, because they just made their own. But I think Neo City Expert is a good one. Either it has a wide variety of passable turns, or maybe the AI is just really bad. But it's got at least one convincing hairpin, and an insane uphill to chicane to downhill to hairpin that is sure to reward the daring driver. I mean, just look at this! How cool is that? Going into the summer stretch, we draw from another oddity, Highland Cliffs from the later Ridge Racer games. Very much like a Spa replacement, this track has a pretty unforgiving set of sharp turns throughout the hillside, including a section of the track right on the cliff. Is this safe? Probably not. But like I said, I'm not worried about safety right now. There's admittedly this small bump that cars fly over, but I figure that some repaving can fix it. This race will be more like one of attrition, as the undulating corners and varying elevations will make it difficult to properly master. Now, I don't know if you've noticed, but each race on my calendar is completely different from the last to keep the teams on their toes. And what could be more different from a perilous cliffside than a roval? That's right, I have rovals on this calendar. And the first one is Autosport Raceway from Grid Autosport. There are locations on this track that are pretty much flat out, including what I would say is about the first third of the entire track, until the cars have to negotiate a right turn into the backstretch wall and then slow down to make the next infield left-hander. I imagine that this turn will act like a Darlington strike, where some drivers will go too fast and miss their apex or lifting point. In addition, there are a couple of tight turns which should overall combine to make some great racing. We're now in July and we have to make use of the summer weather by traveling to someplace absolutely beautiful. And in my mind, no track is more beautiful than Cape Ring from Gran Turismo. It's not perfect for Formula 1 racing, but damn is it enticing. The front stretch should have good passing, many of the corners are flat out and unforgiving of the slightest mistakes, and I personally appreciate the symmetry of the track. But check out that 360-degree high-speed turn over there. That is just nuts. Fans are going to turn out in droves just for that thing. The next city circuit will be much different in terms of flow. Chicago from the Grid series. Chicago's track is quite literally a series of grids, with some long straights into hairpins as well. It's a classic type of overtake that we know is possible in Formula 1, so I'm expecting some great racing here, and it should prepare the drivers for the next big event. With race 12, we're halfway there, and I want to celebrate by creating a marathon that resembles no other track on the calendar. Now, I'm willing to be talked out of it, but I think this race is so out of the ordinary that its mere mention alone could turn heads. The Bridge Tour from Project Gotham Racing. It's essentially 4 super long, super fast bridge straightaways connected by a series of tight Macau-esque turns that are easy to lock up or understeer. Most passing will be done on these large straights, but passing opportunities are possible off the bridges as well. This track is incredibly long, so laps will be few while times will be high. It would almost be like an endurance race of sorts. And again, I'm willing to be talked out of it, but it's the halfway point, and I want to celebrate it with something special. Don't like it? Well, we can replace it with any other New York track. I would suggest New York from the mainline Gran Turismo games, or New York from Forza Motorsport 1. But really, I just want to see a race course with an absurdly long straight. I think it'd be cool. Now, what could be different from a city circuit? Well, how about another undulating track? We'll use Lakeside Parkway from the Ridge Racer games. Ridge Racer tracks have a way about using elevation and tight corners to make perfect high-speed drifting arcade tracks. And Lakeside Parkway is no exception. Translated into Formula 1, I think there's some potential. Especially this turn right outside of the tunnel. Don't tell me that isn't scary. Next up is another Live for Speed track, Kyoto Ring Long. Much flatter than Lakeside Parkway, Kyoto Ring kind of feels a bit like Suzuka in design and landscape, except if Suzuka had an oval in the middle of it. There are a variety of corners that should make for some good moments, but that oval straightaway could be a highlight, and I hope people will come out in droves for that kind of seating. Okay, this next one might be really weird, so hear me out. Mario Circuit on Mario Kart DS. Taking some creative liberties, I think it could work. The double hairpins and S's could be interesting, and taking away all of the obstacles, it could be a decent track. Plus, I really wanted to sneak Mario Kart in here somewhere. Side note, the GBA games have a lot of good tracks as well. Now, let's go for a more proven and realistic track, and one that might be considered a classic to many. Grand Valley Speedway from Gran Turismo. This track is known in the video games for having a challenging endurance race, but with a variety of corners, I think it could work in Formula 1 as well. I admit that as someone who hasn't been watching the sport for a long time, a lot of my tracks seem to rely quite a bit on hairpins. But it also has a variety of corners that test people's skill. I especially like this switchback here. Not to mention the environment itself is so varied throughout the track, and it's not just about the track design itself, but looks are part of the appeal, and this track definitely appeals. Grand Valley Speedway is definitely a complicated track, but with the calendar nearing its end, it's time to up the ante. Now, I had reservations about putting the track on the list. It's a little too bumpy, kind of tight, and probably fatal in many crashes, but a friend of mine wanted it, so screw it. Camino Viejo from Forza Motorsport is on the list now. It's a fan favorite for how difficult yet satisfying the turns are to maneuver through, and even if the calendar has a worrying amount of difficult to pass tracks, I mean, at least they're interesting. I mean, look at it, it's better than such. For the next track, we'll go back to the city with a pretty conventional street course, the track from Super Monaco GP. Despite the name, it is not identical to the real track, due to computer limitations. It's wider and more straightforward than Monaco or even Rio, but it's still difficult with its chicanes and its fairly fast corners. We're moving toward the end of the season, and the cooler weather in the northern hemisphere can lead to a race at Richmond Plains. Another forgotten Real Racing 2 track, Richmond looks like it was made for F1. It's got a couple of weird chicanes, including this one at the start of the race. And the turns are medium speed, but can still work for passing. We then go from a simplistic track with lots of tight corners to a complex one with fast corners. Live for Speed tracks absolutely knock it out of the park, and Fern Bay Black is one of the best. Obviously, there are some particularly good overtaking positions on this track, but a lot of the turns are at high speed. There's a lot here to memorize, which makes it a challenging track, and that's kind of what I want for the title fight. I'll admit right now that I'm treating the title contenders like a jerk, but I want to make the last leg of the calendar incredibly tough. Either the lead driver will make mistakes and close the gap, the contending driver will lose out due to a terrible mistake, or both of them will be on edge for the entire season. I want them to earn the final race title fight. And they'll have to earn a good finish at the next track, Mist Falls. It's a Ridge Racer 7 track, meaning it's got heavy elevation changes and tight corners meant for drifting. The lack of runoff will make it difficult to pass on the tight corners, and mistakes will be met with extreme prejudice. Additionally, part of the track runs behind a waterfall, which is hella cool. Now, I bet in the real world, a place like this would be a national park or a protected reserve, so this isn't really a logical choice, but this is a fictional calendar and nothing has to be logical so long as it's possible. Such as a Formula 1 race through the streets of Paris. No way in hell is that going to happen, especially not around the Arc de Triomphe. But it would be fun. I'll be using the grid Paris track. Just like the prior track, it's tight and unforgiving as street courses usually are. There are also elevation changes that affect braking points and flat out turns that can wreck you if you graze the barrier. But on top of all things, it's fair. There are plenty of places to overtake. And once again, I want a tough, punishing track to gatekeep the drivers from chasing the points in the season finale, but at the same time, I don't want a circuit that won't give the drivers anything to work with. And Paris will give drivers an opportunity. And with that, we reach our season finale, Sunset Peninsula from the Forza Motorsport games. Now, compared to the previous few tracks on the schedule, this one is incredibly tame. It's a roval with a flat infield and some hairpin turns, like a lesser Indianapolis Grand Prix. But if a championship battle makes it this far, I'd like to give the drivers an open playing field to work with. They've gone through the trials and tribulations to get here, they're exhausted, and they have the weight of the sport on their shoulders. The least I can do is make the track easier to navigate. It's got plenty of straights and passing opportunities that allow for top tier drivers to carve through the field. And besides, if we've gone through all of these races and the points battle is still equal, I'd like to see a champion be decided with an ordinary, no-frills track. Also, it is at a roval, which means big grandstands and more room for camping. I figure that the atmosphere of the crowd will make up for any uninteresting design. And that there is my 24 race Formula 1 fictional track calendar. In my opinion though, 24 races is way too much for a calendar that's supposed to have worldwide travel, so if we wanted to turn it down to 20 tracks, which I believe to be an ideal number, I would personally delete maybe the Bridge Tour, Mario Circuit, Mist Falls, and Midfield Raceway. Now, as someone who doesn't play every racing game ever, I'm sure I missed some good tracks, and in fact there are a lot of tracks that I was sad to leave out. Seattle Circuit from Gran Turismo, for instance, was one of my favorites but probably wouldn't work. The Mario Kart Super Circuit tracks looked to be viable, and then there were some deep cuts, such as Highland Raceway from Sega's Indy 500. So let me know what you think in the comments. I'm curious to hear what more die-hard fans of Formula 1 would think. What fictional racetracks would you add to your calendar?